Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Balls in Your Face Marketing. I have with me a serial entrepreneur, someone who has impressed me for quite some time now. Her name is Jaime Cohen, and Jaime has spent her life researching human interaction and the way people think. Her passion for and exposure to many languages and cultures led her to think critically about how we communicate and connect. Jaime is a speaker, communication coach, and advisor, and creator of The Right Words. She teaches you to level up your communication skills and become well-equipped to connect more deeply during any interaction. And in addition to that, you just recently did a LinkedIn learning course that I think you're launching pretty soon. You've got Find Me Fridays, which you've been doing for a long time. You did food talks, et cetera, et cetera. So tons of stuff that we could talk about. Jaime, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I've been watching the show for a long time, and I feel so special to actually be on it.
Well, you're long overdue to join us, so I'm glad that we finally managed to make this happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So where do we want to start here? I mean, let's talk about communication and confidence and empathy. That's something that you and I were just talking about a little before we started recording here. So why don't you share some of your thoughts on that?
Sure. So before we got started, we were talking a little bit about what we want to achieve in life, what we actually achieve in life, and how we perceive and how others perceive what we're doing. And when you see someone who has just a really electrifying aura.
I was going to use that word too. Aura was the word that comes to mind, and I don't tend to believe, I don't like to think magically, but you're right. Some people just have that. You're right.
They just have this presence about them, and they're not necessarily the most well-spoken. They're not necessarily the most attractive. They just have this something that draws you to them. And that's something that I really like to focus on when I'm talking to anyone who is working on building up their confidence or building their business or helping or working on clarifying their message. Is confidence is a huge part of our success. And confidence is something that we can, it's something that we don't need to necessarily have right away in order to act confident. So we can present ourselves in the way that we want to be seen and in the way that we're hoping to achieve eventually. And so a lot of people will say, well, I don't really know what I want, and I don't like the way that I look, and I this and that, and I don't sound right. And I always tell them, just imagine, think of one day in your life where you felt really, really great. Like you loved your hair that day, or you gave a presentation and it went really well, and try to remember that feeling and use that as you move through the world, because people are drawn to great energy, even if it's regardless of the woo-woo stuff. You can feel all humans are energy. We're all electrical signals passing through back and forth. And so if you think about it, when you go into an environment that's really negative, you feel that even if you're not necessarily in the conversation. But if you go into an environment that's really exciting and where people are talking really positively, you feel the excitement and you absorb that, and people want to be around that energy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The way that I often look at it is when people talk about the subject of confidence, something that I often say is make a distinction between a big ego and a strong ego, because they're not the same thing, right? And so, a big ego is not desirable at all. And again, that usually is a turnoff. So exactly, sometimes when people talk about confidence, they're thinking about, how do I present myself? How do I look and seem confident? But if you don't really feel good about yourself, people see right through it. That's the thing, is you can't really fake it anymore.
Yes. Well, and actually having a big ego is a huge identifier of people who have low self-esteem.
Exactly.
Which people think oppositely. They think, well, if I'm really confident in myself and if someone compliments me and I take it, then they're going to think I have a huge ego. But if someone gives you a compliment, it actually makes the person feel better when you take it graciously. If you give them 10 reasons why their compliment is wrong, then it makes them feel bad. It makes them feel like they've made a mistake. And every interaction that you have, it's about the other person. And this is something that I talk about when we discuss storytelling. When you're telling your story, you are the one who's experienced it, but your story isn't about you. If you're hoping that people will connect with your story, you are the main character in your story, but your story is about them. What are you going to be able to explain? What are you going to be able to say that is going to resonate with the people who are listening, so they can say, I could imagine that. I've been there, and wow, I felt like I couldn't get through this, but this is the step that I should have taken, and I totally relate with that.
Yeah,
so
no,
confidence is a huge part of that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Exactly. That, especially as part of storytelling, the reader or the audience is the hero.
Yes.
And exactly, you're just the facilitator of that. And exactly as you said, people who you're right that big egos tend to be a strong indication that somebody is in fact has low self-esteem. And and I think a strong ego, there's no limit to how strong your ego can be. Right. I think that there's nothing wrong with it. And it's about being comfortable in your own skill and embracing your weaknesses just as much as your strengths.
Yes. Instead of hiding them, because a lot of people are so worried that someone's going to discover that. I mean, and this also connects with imposter syndrome, but people are so worried that someone's going to discover their flaws and then stop liking them or stop using their business. But our flaws are just an indication of our willpower and our grit and our ability to move forward, because if we have that strong ego, then we're always working towards strengthening our weaknesses. So we're aware of them, and we know that, and this is a big thing when it comes to having a successful business, knowing how to delegate, being aware of your weaknesses, and of course working on improving those, but also surrounding yourself with people who can help you facilitate those specific things that are not your strengths. And then you can move together towards your goal.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. Those flaws are what make us human. There's something about that when somebody almost comes off as perfect, it almost turns people off. They're almost annoyed by it. They're like, oh, she's so perfect, and they hate it.
And it's really funny. There's this, I don't want to say influencer, because she's an influencer, but she's also like an amazing business owner. She has a podcast. Her name is Lauren Everett Bostic. She runs the Skinny Confidential. And something that is so amazing about her is, like, you look at her and she looks absolutely perfect. Like, her skin is perfect, her hair is perfect, her makeup's perfect, but she talks to you about like all the things that make her imperfect and that she's working on. And she's like, have you ever been there? Because I just had to get a new razor so I could shave my big toe this morning. Like, just things that are so ridiculous that people are like, oh my gosh, I can't let anyone know that I do that. And she's like this supermodel looking woman. And she's like, yeah, this is what I do. This is what we all do. And that makes you feel connected to her, because you're like, wow, if someone like her does those things and feels confident about it, then I can too. I can talk about all the things that make me me. And that's a huge part when it comes to building your brand. Like, of course you want to promote yourself in this really positive light. You want to have a lot of confidence, but the thing that really allows people to connect with you is talking about where you came from to get to where you currently are.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great example of what you're talking about earlier, about how she's making the audience the hero by revealing her own flaws.
Absolutely. And so you feel like you're her friend, and you feel like you can connect because you're like, here's this person who's having all of this success, but she's just like me.
Yeah, exactly. Very cool. And so let's talk about where empathy comes into the equation, because for me, that's a big factor. I think anybody, certainly in marketing and communications, that to me is the number one skill. This is why I often, say that I women tend to be often better marketers than men, in particular, because women tend to score a little higher on that empathy scale. So tell me your thoughts about, where does that fit
in? Well, a lot of people get like grossed out or get this icky feeling when they hear the word empathy. They think of something that's mushy gushy, but really another way that you can look at it, or other words that you can use, are understanding the needs of the person you're speaking with, or understanding the needs of the people that surround you. And that that is a huge part of success in communication, in negotiation, and conflict resolution, which those are two things that I work on a lot with my clients. If you're dealing with someone who has a really strong personality, or who is not treating you well, or who's not treating other people well, usually your first inclination is to start judging and think, well, this person is awful and they did this and this and that. But another way you can look at it is, what led this person to act this way today? So for instance, I have this strange interaction with a friend recently, and out of nowhere, she just totally exploded on me for something that was just, I made a mistake and I apologized immediately, but she got mad about the principle of the issue. And so for the average person thinking about that, they're like, oh, well, that's insane. Like, the principle, what are you talking about? But also I can think about, like, what sort of experiences has she had in her life? How does she interact with the people around her? And I understand clearly why she reacted the way that she did. And when she's ready to talk again, then I'll be prepared to approach her in a way that's going to be most beneficial to her, in a way that she'll be able to most effectively accept the information that I'm giving to her, so that we can move on. Because it's not about, in a lot of issues, when people have a lot of issues, they either shy away from it. So they say, oh, this weird thing happened, I'm going to ignore it. It's like it never happened. And then you build up resentment. So this is a huge part of empathy, is how do you gain connection and avoid resentment? Mm-hmm. And it's all about the words that you use, but also the goal that you have. Yeah. So there's a 3-step process that I use with people when they're dealing with conflict, or when they want to get to a solution or want to respond in a way that's powerful. And the first step is to check in with yourself. So if someone says something to you and it makes you really angry or really upset, you have to think, what was it that they said that triggered me? I know it wasn't nice, and I know that it was a passive aggressive, and this is just a random situation, not any particular situation. What was it that made me feel the way that I'm feeling? And so once you get an understanding, that self-awareness, self-actualization, then you can move forward. So say, I got triggered because I've had this experience where someone said this thing to me and I felt helpless in that situation. And now I feel reactive because I'm triggered by what this person has said. Mm-hmm. So then you can move on to the second step, which is, what is your goal? So a lot of times if someone says something to you, or especially online, I work with a lot of people on how to respond to like text or emails or things that people wrote in posts, because that sort of communication gets really passive aggressive really quickly. And so, sorry, my husband walked in.
No worries.
And so it's easy to read between the lines, even when there isn't anything to read in between those lines. So if you decide, okay, this person said this, why would they say something like this? What triggered them? Why are they responding in this way? So now, is your goal to win? And usually what that means is, do you want to make them feel bad because you felt they made you feel bad, which doesn't end up leading to anything positive, but instead think, okay, I want to clear this up. Or if something is just totally out of control, maybe this isn't something that I should respond to because this isn't going anywhere fast. I should pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, I wasn't really sure. I think we got some wires crossed and I wanted to check in with you because it seems like we're not on the same page. Like, how can we fix this? And a person who's reasonable will respond well to that, because they'll say, oh, wow, you actually care enough to call me and see if I'm okay. But let's say you're not going to pick up the phone and you want to respond via text or in an online forum or email or whatever it is. And a lot of times it's on like posts on Facebook or Twitter or something like that. Then you have to think, okay, you now know what your goal is. Your goal is to clear up this miscommunication, or your goal is to show the person that you understand where they're coming from, but that you have a different opinion. So now you have to decide, what is your process? How are you going to go about doing this? And this all comes back to storytelling, and also in another way, like presenting a new product almost. So if you think about things that people are willing to accept are usually iterations of things they're already comfortable with. So if you think about something like the iPod, that was a more advanced MP3 player. And then the iPhone was a phone with an iPod in it. And then the iPad was an iPod with a computer without a phone in it, and then so on and so forth. Like things that people were able to accept these things because they were just tiny baby steps up from things they were familiar with. So if you take this all back to now, how does that involve communication at all? Think about what someone is willing to accept. This is the way that they're thinking. So the information they want is around what they've said, because there's this idea called confirmation bias where we believe things, and the things that we believe in an ultimate way, and we surround ourselves with people and things that confirm those thoughts. So if someone feels very strongly about something and they say that to you, and that conflicts your thoughts and your beliefs and your feelings, the way that you can avoid conflict is understanding, okay, well, this is their strong belief. Let me appeal to that belief, but also show them that I think differently, and here's why. And this is something that you can think of also when you're talking about politics. People feel often that their political opinion is attached to their character. So if you disagree with them, you are making a hit at their character. So something that I always say, and I've actually often avoided speaking about politics because I don't love confrontation. I don't love that feeling. It's something that I always do because I know it's important to strengthen relationships and avoid conflict. But a way that you can look at it is recognizing why someone might feel the way they feel. And so this is part of the process. So you recognize why this person feels the way that they feel. So you have your goal already. Now you're recognizing why the person feels the way that they feel, and what is your process going to be to get your point across? Because if they want to have a conversation, how do you do this successfully? So you say, I understand, I can see where you're coming from for this reason and for these experiences that you've had. I feel a little bit differently because of these experiences that I've had, and here's my belief. This opinion isn't something that I'm married to. This is based on my experiences so far, and my opinions and my beliefs are always changing and evolving. And this doesn't affect my value system at all, because those are things that are separate. But people will often put values, beliefs, and character all together, but they're all separate things.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a ton to unpack about in that, but I mean, I think the politics one is a great example, here. So that's one where, for example, see, some people, I love debate, but not everybody does, so for some people, what I consider a debate is just enthusiastic conversation, to them is an argument. So it's exactly kind of to your point about recognizing, okay, that's not how this person likes to communicate. I think one thing too that's always important in those situations too, I think sometimes, is recognizing that sometimes people, and certainly today, this is almost a problem. One thing that I've almost been preaching a lot about today is curiosity over certainty.
Yes.
Let doubt prevail, but you have to accept the fact, exactly as I said, that some people are just locked into their opinions, and there's nowhere to go, and there's no room for discussion. If you can tell, like, there's a huge difference between somebody who's locked into their position and they're not going to change, and it's just you're going to butt heads, versus, as you said, okay, I'm open, I'm not locked into my opinion, I'm open, I'm flexible here. Then it's fun for me, at least, it's a conversation. I'm willing to be persuaded. They might be willing to be persuaded. And you can actually have an interesting conversation. But I think it's also sometimes it's knowing when to just say, okay, forget it. Like there is no conversation to be had. We're just going to talk. We're going to be crossing paths. And you brought up another good point about biases. There's all kinds of biases that people have. And so I think you're right that there's a huge advantage in saying, not just, okay, I think this is how you interpret it, but you can even, I think back to the point of empathy of saying, okay, so I get the impression, maybe I'm wrong, but I get the impression that you're somebody who, reacts to things this way or feels this particular way, and that's totally legitimate. And so you kind of at least disarm because I think disarming is a big, especially when when you're talking about conflict resolution. At least, often what it is people just want to have it recognized what their feelings or what their opinions are, and just be understood. They don't need you to necessarily validate it or argue it or whatever the case might be, or even have a conversation. They just want to feel understood and appreciated. And that often, though, can open the door to an actual conversation.
Absolutely. And a lot of times when you're having conversations about topics that can be really contentious, it's not your job to convince that person otherwise. It's not your job to give them your opinion. If you're having a conversation where they're asking for your opinion, or they say something that maybe like invokes your opinion, that's a great place to have that conversation. But for instance, I was having a conversation with someone about politics, and it was very one-sided. They were just telling me what they felt, and I strongly disagreed with everything they were saying, and was asking them more questions about why they felt the way they felt. Their goal was to convince me. And they said, well, isn't that something that you believe? I said, not necessarily. And they said, well, what's the point of this conversation? The only point of talking about politics is to convince someone else of your opinion. And then I knew at that point, there was no point at all in moving forward with the conversation. And I just said, I can see how you might feel that way. I don't necessarily agree.
Yeah.
Let's talk about something else.
Yeah. No, exactly. There is exactly. Sometimes you just have to let it go. I think the other thing too.
Letting it go is so hard, but you have to.
But you have to do it. And then the other thing too is that sometimes you have to have a certain degree of confidence in the other person's ability to later on think about it and dwell on it. So often that's something that I've sort of learned to do with time is, okay, is there a window where, if let's say I disagree with someone on something, then I'd say, okay, is there a little window where maybe they might be open to this? And no, I don't expect them necessarily to all of a sudden turn tail and just go, oh, wait a minute, you're right. But sometimes what you can do is kind of just plant a seed.
Yes.
And more later now, I find that exactly like later on, it'll be a week or months later, someone will say, I was thinking about what you were saying, and now they've had some thought, and that's a wonderful feeling for me. I mean, I just love the fact that it impacted them. But no, they're not necessarily, especially in a situation like the ones that we're talking about, their guard is up at that moment. Right? And so sometimes you just need to let it sit for a little while, let them dwell on it for a little bit.
Absolutely. When our goal isn't to convince, but instead to connect, we often have a much better result. And it's that what you're talking about is the idea of letting something marinate. So asking the right questions, accepting that the opinion is different than yours, and saying something like, have you ever considered this? And if that causes a negative reaction, to just drop it. But like you said, maybe weeks, months, years later, they'll say, I was thinking about what you said, and I can see why you said that now. And that's where the connection happens, because your goal isn't to show them that they're wrong, because that's where a lot of conflict comes from. People are made to feel, either by themselves or by words that they see as negative, that they're wrong, and that they feel like the other person wasn't being empathetic or didn't have any compassion for their situation. And this is a huge part, like a huge part of successful communication and empathy is listening. And we spend so much time wanting to use the perfect words that we don't end up listening clearly to what the other person is saying. Instead, we're waiting for our moment to say the perfect thing that we've had in our head. But if we're focusing on that thing, then we're not actively listening. We're waiting. And then you have a total disconnect, because a lot of what someone says is in between the lines. So going back to that 3-step process and using empathy, the best way to really connect with someone is to take time to listen. in a way that you can read between the lines. So that way, when they're done, instead of having that perfect thing you're going to say, you could say something like, from what I understand, this is what you were saying, and this and this and this. Am I mistaken, or is this right? And then they could say, well, it's almost right, but what I meant was, because a lot of times people will say something expecting a certain response, and different things, this is another idea of perspective, different things have different meanings to different people. So they might say something which definitively means something to them, but means something totally different to you or to someone else. So having that sort of summarization of what they've said makes people feel like you were really listening. So actually, something I always recommend to people if they feel like, I don't feel like I'm connecting with people and I want to have stronger relationships, but I don't know how, is using this idea of summarization, really listening to what someone's saying, especially when they're talking about themselves. So they'll tell you their story and this thing that happened to them, and then you just basically repeat back to them what they said. And 9 times out of 10, they'll be like, oh my gosh, no one has ever understood me like that before. Like, how did you know all of that? And in your head, you're like, you literally just told me that.
Yeah, exactly.
But the reason people feel like that is because not no one, but a lot of people aren't listening. So they're speaking and their information is just going out into the ether. But when you take that time to summarize it and give it back to them, they feel like you've uncovered something for them. And then that's something that really drives connection.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're first of all, a couple things have kind of come up there. One is that what you're talking about applies very much to sales, by the way. So for example, that's something that I've kind of picked up from a gentleman named Stan Way. When he talks about, let's say, the first call with somebody, his magic words for the call number 1 is tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. And the reason is precisely so that on a follow-up call where he's actually going to be leading into a sale, now he starts saying, you said this. And on the subject of conflict resolution, I mean, that is sort of the foundational of what, if anybody goes to, let's say, like couples therapy or something, that's what the exercise that they'll walk you through is precisely that before you respond to what the other person says, you have to say, okay, I heard you say this. Is that right? And then, and if they say, no, that's not what I meant, okay, then you got to go back. And if they say, yeah, okay, all right. Now, and if the answer is yes, then you can kind of move forward and say, okay, this is how that makes me feel. And then they got to flip, they're supposed to flip the role, right? And say, okay, I just heard you say this. Is that right? And that is, like I said, that's the foundation of conflict resolution for sure. But what we're talking about has so many applications. And it's exactly what you said, like, I think a lot of it, in addition to confirmation bias, right, which is exactly as you said, we just think that we surround ourselves with people or ideas. I very actively, if I have an idea about something, I will, purposely search in Google the opposite to see, what the other side of that is. But, in a debate, you can get very complicated with this in terms of like Myers Briggs, which is, sort of 4 different letters. But the simple way is really kind of like a personality grid, right, of sort of introvert, extrovert, and so forth. And so really, at a minimum, 75% of the population does not think like you. You are in one of those, in a very basic sense, you're in one grid. 25% of the people are there with you, and the other 75% are in the other one. And if you learn you can actually just start to pick up on where people are in that grid very quickly, not even sometimes without even with just how they present themselves, how do they decorate their office, how, tons of little indications about what grid do they fall into. And from there, if you really get used to it, then you can say, okay, this is great. Like, now I know, okay, this is you can create as sort of an initial framework for who that person is and what do they respond to most.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I actually just took one of the online Myers Briggs tests from that. It's called 16personalities.com. Yeah. And I love taking those tests because a lot of people feel comfortable when they're able to find a box in which they fit. I feel the opposite. I do not like to be labeled. I do not like titles. I like to just exist in the world.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is that test corroborates those feelings, because I get different values, I guess, every time. And values, I mean by different letter combinations.
Yeah.
Almost every time I take it, if I take it, months apart. Because something that I found is that you can move through those personalities if you have goals that you're setting and if you're self-aware. So I can look through that and say, at one point in my life, I remember being like this, but that's not how I feel anymore. I feel this other way. But by having a deep understanding of all these different people and how they feel and how they interact, now I feel like I have more power in communication, because I can put myself in their shoes and think, I can imagine how that must feel, even if it's something that I haven't experienced it. And I think last night I got what did I get? ENFP. Maybe?
I think was
2% of the population is in this.
Yeah,
in this.
I think that's what I landed on years ago. I haven't taken the test in a while, but yeah.
But I've fallen into other categories before, and even introverted categories, because I'm an ambivert.
Well, okay, I was just about to ask you that, because there is this sort of category in addition to the letter combinations, and that's certainly been the case for me for a lot of years, is that I'm actually quite on the line between many of them. And you're right, but I know lots of people who've shifted that, the letter combinations have evolved over time. Exactly, I think, as you said, based on specific objectives or goals that they intended to achieve, and then sure enough, they've actually shifted themselves where they wanted to be. But the sort of ambivert, as you said, is very true for, I think, a lot of people, and that's a very unique skill. And again, that makes sense that you would be in communications because of that. Because again, exactly, you're able to kind of see same thing. Like I'm sort of a mix between. I have a component of introvert, I have a component of extrovert. I'm not necessarily one or the other, but precisely, I think that's what allows the empathetic person to be, relate to other people. So that's why, again, I always say it's one of the most important skills for marketers and communication.
Absolutely. But I think another thing that adds on to that is, if you're someone who is extremely empathetic, you need to be even more self-aware than the average person, because someone who's an empath absorbs the energy of everyone around them. So, which is really hard, and is something that was a very negative part of my life for a long time, because I was just constantly drained. So I thought, okay, I must be an introvert because I need time alone to recharge after I'm around a lot of people. But what I found recently, so I had this amazing opportunity to speak at a summit in Dubai just a few weeks ago. And it was a leadership summit where we were talking about resilience and confidence and communication, and how to use all of these things to become more effective in each of the attendees' respective careers. And something that I was realizing, and something that we were discussing, is that when you surround yourself with the right people, no matter how much time you spend with them, you don't get drained. And this was something that I hadn't really experienced before, because a lot of the time in our childhood and in our adult life, we make friends with people who are in our periphery. The people who are closest to us physically, those people become our friends, whether that's our neighbors or the people that we work with or the people that we're involved in a sport with. Those are the people that become our friends. That doesn't necessarily mean that those are our perfect matches. And that's something that's been so incredible about LinkedIn. And I think why people get so emotional about the connections they make, because I've made some of my very best friends, people who feel like family, through LinkedIn, because I connect with people who we were meant to be friends. Like we wouldn't have, but there's no way we would have met. I met a friend who's on the other side of the world, like in Dubai, 7,000 miles away. And we were absolutely meant to be friends. We never would have met had it not been for LinkedIn. And with that person and with all of these other people that were at the event, we spent hours together, 10 hours a day. And I was exhausted from all the activities we were doing and the time change, but I wasn't drained. And that's something that it was an incredible experience, because even for someone who's extremely self-aware and someone who doesn't like to be put into a box, you still spend your life thinking, okay, this is who I am. This is how I feel in these environments. But when you are willing to see the other side, just like when you have a belief and you go online and look for the other opinion, when you're willing to accept that maybe you don't always understand exactly how you feel, or there might be another way to interpret that, you have these sort of revelations that can totally change the trajectory of your life and your career. And the more you allow yourself to have these experiences, the more effective you'll be as a business person, as a friend, as a partner, as a colleague. This is the thing that allows you to use empathy and to use understanding but also to use direction to connect most effectively with those around you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm relating so much to what you're talking about, because it's still something even to this day. I mean, I'm same thing. I'm kind of become aware about the sort of pitfalls of that sort of empathy, connection-driven personality that leaves us somewhat vulnerable. And same thing that I've said that for years, that I've always had a preference for situations like this that are one-on-one versus a party, because for me, I mean, a party is just overwhelming, because I'm sensitive to tonalities and facial expressions and micro expressions and all these things. I cannot help myself but as I'm talking with somebody, I'm just seeing things in my periphery that are, that oh, looks like that's about to turn into a fight, and oh geez, she seems really uncomfortable in this situation over there, and it's just too much noise. And then exactly, it's really only in recent years that I've sort of coming around to exactly what you're saying about surrounding yourself with people that lift you up, and removing anybody who doesn't. And then the other thing that you're talking about there that I think I agree with, especially in particular about LinkedIn, and this is what got me to sort of talking about this sort of movement of meaning, is that I think, with the internet being still relatively new in its infancy, there was this kind of narcissism within it. Everybody was kind of presenting this false, just using it for nonsense. But there's people like yourself, like myself, like a number of people in particular on LinkedIn who are saying, maybe there's a little more that we could be doing with this technology than taking pictures of our spaghetti and spending 5 hours trying to get the perfect selfie. Maybe there's a way that we can use it to genuinely connect with people. And I think that's what you're talking about. And I think that is a beautiful thing, because it's the same thing. It's all of a sudden about these friendships that seem profound and really meaningful. And in some cases, I still haven't met them face to face, but it'll happen. And
yeah, it's so incredible. I mean, we haven't met face to face.
No, not yet. But and again, I'm sure it's going to happen. It's going down. Yeah, exactly. One of these days, whether it's some LinkedIn local somewhere or who knows, but for sure, I have no doubt. There's never, Brian Schulman is somebody who I haven't met in person yet, but I imagine he and I will meet. Roger Wilkerson is apparently coming to Toronto, and he's somebody who I've connected with on I really sort of appreciate his critical thinking approach, his way of being a critical thinker. I think in particular, compared to all other platforms, LinkedIn is the one for sure that you can create those, and that's. At the end of the day, this is where actually it's funny how, everybody's these days it's all about, how do you automate this and how do you do that? And I'm saying, what, I see a return to classical networking, right? That's what I see LinkedIn as being a platform for that. Somebody was asking me, is Facebook better than LinkedIn? I'm like, well, Facebook is a great transactional advertising platform. It's not a place that I will necessarily do most of my genuine networking. Whereas for me, LinkedIn is like a business convention, right? Yeah. Where it's just sort of, and the more you show up and the more you walk around the floor and introduce yourself to people. And again, you don't just say, hi, would you like to buy this? Would you do that at a convention? No. Exactly. You want to get to know them. Ask them questions. Questions is a great way to really open up the door, I think.
Yes. And if people, a lot of people are worried about awkward silences. And the thing that you can always revert to if you feel an awkward silence coming on and you're not yet comfortable with just sitting in that silence, because silence can be powerful, is to ask questions. But on the idea of classical networking, the best way to do that is to not go looking for business, but to go looking for friendships. And my friend Jane Scudder, who I met through, someone found me on LinkedIn and asked me to speak at the French American Chamber of Commerce in Chicago, and she was on the panel too. And so her name's Jane Scudder. She's a cultural anthropologist. So she also works in communications, but she works with politicians and like celebrities and big personalities, and helps them figure out the things that they need to do and the things that they want to do. And something that she said to me really resonated with me. And she said, when I go to networking events, the way that I look at it is I'm going to go catch up with some people. So these people, I don't necessarily know them, but if I think about this as catching up with a friend, then that removes all of the pressure of, I need to give you my card and we need to do business together and we collaborate. And then when you actually want to do business together, you're reaching out to some acquaintance who you don't really know versus getting to know someone and building a relationship. So when you need something, or when you see an opportunity that might be good for them, you already know their ethics, you know how their morals, the way that they function in a particular environment, and you can trust them. Mm-hmm. And so that creates a much better network than just meeting a bunch of people and having a bunch of loose connections. You actually have a relationship with these people.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's what do they value? Right. I mean, because ultimately, that's the funny thing is, business, people often just think of it in transactional terms, and it's about the money. And yes, everybody wants more money, but why? Like, the money itself isn't really anything. It's what can you do with it? What do they want to do? And that's how you know someone, right? You don't even know, you can't even really say anything about when somebody says what they value. In a way, it's just how do they behave? Like, that's my sort of interpretation is, the best way to know someone is, look at their bank statement and their search history. It's how they behave that really tells you what they actually value. So by the way, I'm guessing that you're like me. I have no problem with silence. I love silence.
I don't mind it at all. And actually, having grown up in just an interesting environment, I always wanted to see what would happen. So basically, some of the research that I've been doing on human interaction has been since I was a kid. And whenever I was in an awkward situation, I would see how far I could push it till its ultimate awkwardness and see what would happen. And I did a lot of this during college because it wasn't harmful in any way. It wasn't like a life or death situation. It was just, this is an awkward situation. Let's see how far we can push this. And
it's a bit of a shit disturber in there, but
a little bit. But
I can see the fun in it.
I never did anything that hurt anyone or impacted someone so negatively that stayed with them for the rest of their life. But something that I used to do when I was on campus in college is I would, if I just had some time in between classes, I would like go up to random guys and be like, hey, it was so great seeing you this weekend, and just start talking about something that had happened at this party that we went to. And it's like, wasn't that so crazy? And just see how far I could go before they were like, yeah, or they were like, I'm sorry, I don't think we've met before.
That's hilarious.
Oh, my bad. Or I would just keep going and see like where the conversation would go. And if they wouldn't break, then I wouldn't be like, oh, we actually didn't meet. This was just an experiment to see what you would do. I would just like finish the conversation and be like, well, great seeing you. Bye. And I did this I wish I would have kept this data, because this would have been like a PhD by now. I did this with so many people because I wanted to see the name of the research. I had a name of the research. I just didn't catalog the data. Was how strong the relationships, like the strength of relationships based on the location of connection. So based on where you meet, how strong will your relationship be? Because I don't know, maybe it's not like this in all college or university situations, but it was really easy to meet people and make friends in Boulder, Colorado. People like to talk. I made a bunch of friends just walking down the street. I saw someone, like we were at a stoplight. I saw someone who was interesting. We started talking and then like hit it off and exchanged numbers and then became friends. And one of my best friends, one of my friends met her in a coffee shop, and then they really hit it off. And then she brought her to a gathering. And then, we've been friends for 12 years now.
It's funny how different cities have that sort of cultural feel. Like Montreal is like that. You can strike up a conversation with anybody, anywhere, in the grocery store, on the street. And then Toronto is a much more sort of business culture and kind of, eyes to your shoes kind of a thing. I love that little experiment though. This is why you're a great guest for the show, because that takes balls. But maybe what you should do is do it again, but with a hidden camera. That would be hilarious.
Funny thing now is that I feel like I had a lot more energy to do those sorts of things.
Yeah.
I was 18 to 21, and now years later, I'm like, I could, but I mean, what I do still do, because I always want to make sure that because the way that we interact is always evolving, especially as we get more connected with technology. So I'm always asking people, like if I'm thinking of a situation that I'm going through or that someone's going through, I ask them, if you've ever been in this situation, like how did you feel? How did you respond? How did the other person respond? And I catalog that all in my head, which for someone with ADD it's great. And it's sort of like what you were talking about, like you notice the micro momentary expressions, you notice every single thing that's going on around you, and 90% of that stuff has nothing to do with you. So asking questions about other people who've experienced these things helps to clarify that information, to see something through someone else's perspective who has focus versus me, who has every thought that I've ever had in my entire life cycling through my head. And then I always say, when I have all the information that I need, it's all in here, but the files, they're all open and the papers are all over
the filing system could use improvement. I hear you.
Yes.
I hear you.
I know this because I've had like several minor procedures done, and my dad was in the room, and when I was sedated, he would ask me questions about science that I had learned. And like, if you ask me the questions now, it would probably take me a while to get to them, but he would ask me a question and I'd just be like Planck's constant or Bernoulli's principle or all these different things. And I just like,
while on severe.
But if you ask me now, I'm like, oh, like, is it 6 point? Well, I don't know.
All right. Well,
but that's getting a little off topic, but the whole point of all of this is that the way that we interact and the way our confidence level and our empathy comes from a bunch of different variables and experiences that we've had throughout our lives. Our inner monologue actually comes from the way that our parents spoke to us and the way they talked about themselves. So if you have like a really negative inner monologue, that can be one of the reasons why. So having good awareness of yourself and the other people around you will allow you to connect more deeply. So if you spend time listening to others actively, listening to yourself and trying to understand why you think the way that you think, and if you're not, because empathy is something that you learn as a child, and I'm not against it, but I'm not confident that if you're not an empathetic person that you can learn that as an adult unless you go through something really traumatic. But what you can do, which is equally effective, is you can feign empathy. So you can say, well, in my heart, I don't understand this, but if I could just put myself into their position and think, why are they feeling that way, and see like, okay, they went through this experience, that's why they feel that way. I can't relate to that. So this is not me, but someone who isn't empathetic. I can't relate to that, but now I understand based on this information that I've taken in why they might feel the way they feel. And that's just as effective, because no one's looking inside and seeing like if your heart is swelling or if it's cold. They're just experiencing the energy that's coming from you and experiencing your interest in them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a powerful thing in communication.
Yeah. It's funny. It's funny for some reason when you're what you're just talking about, it reminds me though exactly that, well, two things. I guess one is that I just certainly, we've learned a lot in recent years about neuroplasticity and how in fact that people can really sort of rewrite the way that they think about things. It's a really fascinating study I was reading the other day about monks and how, because they've spent so much time and energy, they are able to focus in a way that the average person, you and I, just can't even compare. And this is based on, having thrown them into CAT scans and watch this region of their brain that does that. So I think people can learn this stuff, and in particular through like cognitive behavioral therapy, it helps you kind of rewrite those pathways. But something else that I've kind of noticed in particular, and I don't know about, I get the feeling that maybe you can relate to this being an empath, that maybe for some reason we are magnets for narcissists.
Yes.
And sometimes people will describe them as almost having no empathy. But in reality, my observation is that no, they have it. They can read people. They just don't care. So that information is really more just something that they just look at it as, instead of looking at it in the way that you and I would, in terms of, okay, now I can relate to this person in this way. They're looking at it as, okay, what's the utility of it, right? And how can I use that to my own advantage?
Yes. And another thing is that, so there are a lot of different types of narcissists, and empaths are definitely a magnet for narcissists. And something that I always work on with myself is that I have a very sensitive BS meter, and I see things that a lot of other people don't. So I call them invisible narcissists, because they're the people that you're so magnetized to, and everyone is just like a huge fan of them. They're like, oh my gosh, this person is amazing, and they make me feel this and that. But really that person is just a manipulative narcissist who is using all that information that you're talking about to their advantage. But there are different types of narcissists. So there are narcissists who have empathy, but they only have it for themselves, or they have empathy so they can collect this information about the people around them, but they don't know how to respond to it. So for instance, I know someone who is a narcissist, and when they were a kid and they would see someone get hurt or get in trouble, their response would be to laugh, because they didn't understand. It made them really uncomfortable because they didn't know how to respond to that situation properly. Yeah. And so
that's a great example, by the way, because that's a wonderful example, because that's one of the things that I've now noticed. Exactly, like people who I can't watch, for example, when they show like wipeout videos, I can't watch it. It's just, I hate them. Some people laugh, right? Some people just think it's hilarious. So that to me actually is, again, a very clear indication of whether somebody's empathetic or not. Is, do they find that funny, or does it make them cringe? It makes me cringe.
Yeah, and it's funny because I guess there are different levels of empathy. I know people who aren't narcissists who love that stuff, and they're like, oh my God, that's so funny. And I can't watch it either. I feel like I have, like mirror synesthesia. Like if someone gets hurt, I can feel it. Yeah. I'm like, oh, ow, like I can't watch that unless someone's getting surgery for some reason, because I know they can't feel it. It doesn't bother me. And like I enjoy watching some of those surgery videos. But I also come from a medical family, so that could be why. But something that's also important to understand is that narcissists are not bad people. Even if they act in horrible ways and do cruel things, they're not bad people, because narcissism is not a genetic quality. It's something that is trained. You're not born a narcissist. It's based on your experiences. So one of the main ways that someone becomes a narcissist is that when they're a child and they maybe they have certain dispositions to have anxiety, or predisposition to have anxiety or depression or any of these things, and they're dealing with those things, and instead of their parents listening and talking through them, they just say like, oh, like buck up, you'll be fine, or they give them things instead of listening, and that teaches them, and that wires their brain in a way that shows them, if I have a problem, I can just fill it with a thing, and nobody is going to come and save me, so I shouldn't care about other people. That way I can protect myself.
Hmm. No, I think that's a very fair observation, because in particular, I got somebody in mind who precisely, exactly, it's not that they're a bad person. They're high on the anxiety scale. And they're high, I would say would score very high in conscientiousness, but
Mm-hmm.
they've got these layers of defense mechanisms
Yes.
that have built up. And you're right. But at one point, I think what I'm learning more and more is that, okay, great, I understand that, but I need to steer clear a little more, because you can't change everybody.
You can't. And I feel like a lot of people who are empathetic, and I think a lot of women feel like they find projects. I know that's something that I used to do when I was a kid, because I couldn't really, I didn't have a lot of control over certain areas of my life. So since I couldn't do anything about that, I would try to positively impact other people, which is extremely draining, because not everyone is ready to be changed. Those people have to want to make a change, or want to become different. If it's imposed upon them, that's not going to happen. But
I was going to ask you, well, because I think this ties into something else that you and I talked about very briefly just before the call, is self-victimization. And what are your strategies for people who maybe are stuck in that? And I think there's probably a lot of people these days who are. What are the strategies to deal with that?
So I've always had, well, when I was younger, I had negative feelings about people who played the victim. I say this is attention seeking behavior. Well, I think a lot of people do, but I want to break this down just a little bit so that we can see where this comes from and how you can change it. So I would say, well, these people just want attention, and they just found a way to get people to notice them, and so they're going to complain about these things, or they're going to focus on these particular things, and then people will like them more. Or they will use these things to say, I can't do this for this reason. I've been given, this is my fate, and so now I can't do any of these things. And something that my mom always said to me is that, I mean, you can achieve anything you want in life. If you can't get through the front door, you climb in through the window. You don't take no for an answer when it comes to getting what you want. If someone says no, you take no for an answer. But when it comes to personal interaction.
No, I know. I like the fact that you qualified that.
That's very important to understand. But if you apply for a job, or if you have a goal and you've heard no, you find a different way. Because I've heard no a million times until I got to where I needed to be in order to hear maybe, and then to hear yes. So a lot of people who are in really negative situations will say, this is my fate, I can't do anything about it, and so this is how I'll move forward in life. And then they build up all this resentment because they want something that they believe they can't have, and the world has said that they can't have, but it's actually self-imposed. And of course, there are things like mental health and finances and physical locations that make things harder. But if you truly want something, apart from being a prisoner where there's nothing you can do until you're released, or if you find a way to escape, you can move forward positively. And something that I realized is, even though I felt so negatively about people who self-victimize, I was acting in some ways like a victim. And it wasn't until the past few years that I realized that, because I had heard no so many times. I kept pushing, but in my mind, I kept saying, well, I guess this is what my life will be like. Even though in the back of my mind, I was like, I'm going to get what I want, there were these conflicting voices. And that sort of ties into something we were talking about at the beginning, where we were talking about being surrounded by the right people in order to have success. And the sad thing is, a lot of people who are toxic and who are holding you back can be people that you love a lot. They can be family, they can be friends that you've had for years. And the thing is that in order to have success, and this is what I realized, is you have to either totally remove those people from your lives. It's very painful, but something that you have to do, or you have to create very strict boundaries that in order to continue the relationship, they'll have to follow. And if they're not willing to, and it's not saying like, these are the rules, and if you can't follow them, then you're a bad person. It's saying, in order for us to have a healthy relationship, this is what I need our relationship to be like. And I'm willing to make compromises, but this is what I need for my health. And setting these boundaries, boundary setting is a huge part of successful communication, successful relationship building. And in order to have success and get the things that you want, you have to establish these boundaries. And this will allow you to remove yourself from the cycle of self-victimization, because it also goes back to confirmation bias. You've been dealt these bad cards, and so you believe that this is all you can do. You're surrounded by people who confirm that all you'll ever be able to do is this. And then if you don't get a second opinion, you'll just remain in that state. And then what good did that do you? And I'll give you a very extreme example. So I've had a lot of different careers and a lot of different, I've been an athlete in a lot of different ways. And during college, I did a lot of bouldering. So that's the climbing low without ropes. And I did it so much that I started to get numbness in my forearms and in my calves. So I went to a neurologist, and he was an old, like a renowned neurologist, but like he was 88 years old. And he told me that if I didn't stop climbing, they were going to have to amputate my arms and legs. I was 19 when I heard this.
Right.
Which, can you imagine being 19 and saying like, yeah, so if you don't stop this thing that you love, you're going to amputate your arms and legs, and you'll have to rely on people for the rest of your life. So that is a situation that is crazy, but you could be in that situation and say, well, it's over for me. These are the cards that I've been dealt, and now I can't move forward from here. Or you can do what I did and have like a meltdown and then get a second opinion.
Right.
And the second opinion will tell you, oh, you have tennis elbow.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
People have these beliefs based on their experience.
I was wondering whether that's where that was going, because it did seem a little extreme. You know, I agree with everything that you're saying there. I would even say the one thing that I would maybe push back on is even prison, I don't know, is the barrier. And the example that I'll use as one of my heroes is Nelson Mandela, where I would say prison made him.
Well, I wouldn't say, I'm not talking about prison. I'm talking about like a prisoner of war, like where you're being tortured and those sorts of things. But I totally agree with you in that sense, because that experience it sculpted him in a really positive way and allowed him to be the change that South Africa needed.
Exactly. And that was the thing, was, you know, he's just a great example of what we're talking about, because he's somebody who in that situation could very easily have fallen into a victim mentality and did not. And if anything, I mean, I think that was one of the greatest sort of healing things for the country when he was elected, was that he was then able to deal with that, the almost victimization of the population, and discourage that impulse for revenge, and say, no, we need to be better and bigger than how we were treated. So it's something about where he embodied that journey of there is a way, there is a path, and a positive, and from a sort of a positive perspective, in a way that I've admired for years. And so I was just I know that I knew what you meant in terms of the prison, not like. Yeah. I'm
glad you brought that up. I agree with that, and I'm also glad you brought up revenge, because that's something that we see in the movies and in TV shows and in books, and we're like, yes, I got my sweet revenge.
Yeah.
The maniacal cackle always cracks me up. But then the thing is, do you think those people look fondly, unless they're like a sociopath or a psychopath, do they look back fondly on that revenge and think, yes, I hurt them so good and I feel great? the best revenge that you can get, and I feel like the only type of revenge that is good is to live a happy and healthy life and become successful. And then when those people who treated you really poorly come to you and want help from you, you can be kind to them, but you don't have to necessarily provide that help that they want. And that's not revenge. That's a good type of revenge, because that's showing them that you can't treat people negatively and then expect that behavior to be rewarded, rather than saying, like, this person made me lose hundreds of thousands of dollars and now I'm going to figure out a way to make them lose everything.
Yeah. No, you're right. I think you're right that revenge is something that actually hurts the person doing it more. As you said, exactly as the saying goes, the best revenge is living well. And that's actually very much in line with, I don't know if you remember, at least a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, there was that sort of challenge going around of let's get real or let's get honest or something like that on. Yeah. And so the story that I chose to tell was one of exactly that, of an incident where I'd been bullied in one little phase of school. What was funny was, so it got to a point where there was no hiding it. Like, somebody jumped on my back, a couple of people started kicking. And so I was bruised up. There was no way to hide it from my mom. My mom talked to the teacher, which I didn't want her to do, but she did anyways. The teacher was pretty savvy, and I think she called out some people in the class that she thought maybe could be it. Mm-hmm. And so, a big part of that story was that years and years later, I ran into one of those people, and he remembered. And what he remembered in particular was the fact that when she called him out, he thought he was about to get in major trouble. But what stuck with him was that I didn't rat him out, that I didn't say that it was them. I wouldn't say so, because it was a big school. So she was like, who's doing it? And I was like, oh, I don't know. And they jumped me from behind. I had no clue. Right. So that stuck with him apparently for the rest. He says, and he said to me, 15 or something, 20 years later, that we ran into each other, and he said exactly that. He said, I remember that. I thought I was going to get in big trouble, and I was totally surprised that you didn't rat me out, and I've respected you ever since. And so that was sort of my message from that story was, that when we show compassion, we come out on top, mm-hmm. which is very much in line, I think, with what you're saying.
And it's incredible how someone who has done you wrong in a really intense way, if you can show them compassion, that can be the little bit of kindness that they needed to change. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And did he apologize to you when you? He
did, yeah, exactly. Years later, exactly in that whole story, he apologized.
It's funny how that happens, and the lengths that people are willing to go to apologize when you don't try to get exact revenge on them. I feel like a lot of us empaths get bullied, and in a number of ways. I got bullied all through middle school, and one of the kids who bullied me would tell me every day that I was going to hell and my religion was wrong, and that I killed Christ and all these different things. And so he got caught once, and they took us down to the principal's office, and they said, well, what do you want to happen? And I said, well, I don't want him to get in trouble. I just want him to stop being mean to me and saying these things, because they're not true and they're unkind and they embarrass me. And years later, he apologized to me in depth, and we became friends. And he said, I don't know why I said those things to you. I actually did some research and found out that I have an ancestor who's Jewish, and I can't believe that I was in a certain headspace. I was repeating things that I heard from people who didn't have all the information, and I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And that can't be a coincidence that something like that happened to you, and something like that. I mean, bullying happened to you in a certain way, and it happened to me in a certain way. We responded with not I don't know necessarily with kindness, but with compassion.
Compassion. Yeah.
And that changed those people.
Yeah. No, and I was watching another story just the other day of George St. Pierre, who's a UFC fighter, and he had been bullied when he was younger, and he saw the guy in the street. He was basically homeless, And so he got out of his car, and the guy recognized him at first, and he wasn't sure. Now all of a sudden, his victim is this very famous, successful UFC fighter. He wasn't sure whether he was about to start exact revenge, but instead he had a conversation with him. He said, "How did you get here?" And he, took whatever money, a couple $100 in his pocket, gave it to him. And then sure enough, like a few weeks later, the guy went to his old home, found it. I think his father answered the door, and he was like looking for him just to thank him, because it turned his life around. I love stories like that. Like, it's funny how like stories of triumph are the ones that make me tear up the most.
Yeah. It's really incredible, because even the people like that, the people who are the meanest, they weren't born mean. They had something bad happen to them. They had multiple things bad happen to them, and they acted out to try to gain control over the things that they couldn't.
Or they were mirroring behaviors that they saw in their homes, or whatever the case, that they saw were effective. And as children do what is effective, not necessarily what's the right way to deal with it. Right. So yeah, it happens all the time.
Absolutely. Oh, I feel so good. I feel like I could go out running now.
Good. Well, Jamie, this has been so much fun. I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours, but for the audience, let me, how can people get in touch with you? Where can they find you?
Sure. Well, you can find me on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/Jaime-Cohen, and Jamie spelled like Jaime. Everyone spells my name wrong, so just be cognizant when you're spelling that out.
I did it once, and it was so good.
It's okay, you corrected it. And that's another thing. If you ever spell someone's name wrong, I find it so much better to have someone spell it wrong and say, "Oh, sorry, I meant to say this," than to just have them ignore it and then continue spelling it wrong.
Oh, no, I can't live with it. Couldn't live with it.
So, yes, Jaime-Cohen. You can find me, you can connect with me on my website at usetherightwords.com, or you can connect with me all across social media at Jaimbalaya, JAIMBALAYA, and I'm sure that Julian, you'll write these in the show notes so that
I will absolutely put them in the show notes. So click the links above or below. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This has been fantastic.
Balls in your face right now.